Hello, this is Michael Wunsch. I'm the plant pathologist at the Carrington Research Center with NDSU, and I'd like to take a moment to share with you our updated recommendations for managing Ascochyta blight in chickpeas with fungicides. As many of you know, we do extensive fungicide efficacy testing and fungicide optimization testing for Ascochyta blight management in chickpeas. In recent years, this has involved 6 acres of field trials here in Carrington and also studies at different locations across the state, both conducted by my team and conducted in collaboration with Audrey Kalile and Tyler Teldy out in Williston. So I'd like to share with you what we have learned, and so that you can hopefully utilize this in your operations this season for improved management of this disease and improved profitability of chickpea production. I have some slides to share with you, and I'm going to pull those up right now, and we'll walk through those slides together. First off, this is research that's been funded with your checkoff dollars from the Northern Pulse Growers Association in conjunction with funding from the North Dakota Crop Protection Product Harmonization Board and Registration Board. And these are funds from the fees that the pesticide companies pay to register their products. And the North Dakota State Legislature has set aside some of those funds to be used for research. And we also have some funding that we utilize to test the efficacy of these products, and that comes directly from the registrants, BSF, Syngenta, and Bayer in this case. With that, I'd like to start off by talking about when do we apply. So first off, if conditions are extremely dry and it's not raining, you really don't have to worry about applying, okay? But if rain is occurring, then you want to go ahead and start scouting your chickpeas, starting in mid to late vegetative growth. If you find 1 to 2 Ascochyta lesions on each of, say, 1 in 50 plants, that's my threshold, about 1 in 50 plants. So 2 in 100 plants with just 1 to 2 Ascochyta lesions on it, and you're at still mid to late vegetative growth, well, and rain is continuing, you better start spraying then. Okay, you need to control this disease and manage this disease when disease levels are low. You start then, and you will have an excellent chickpea crop if you choose your fungicides wisely. Okay, now if at mid to late vegetative growth you see absolutely no Ascochyta, wait until early bloom. And I say early bloom, I mean 50 to 70% of plants with an open blossom. If you're at 50 to 70% of plants with an open blossom and rainfall is occurring, and you don't see disease, you still want to spray then, okay? And the reason is with those rainfall events, you're going to get movement of whatever Ascochyta is out there, and there's always some Ascochyta out there, and you want to make sure that you do not allow that Ascochyta to expand. Your chickpeas are just entering bloom. This is when the disease can do the greatest damage to yield. You need to keep that disease at a low level, okay? And again, though, if it's dry, you can wait, okay? And but again, if the rains are occurring, you want to apply at early bloom, even if you don't find disease. After that point, you should be applying every 10 to 14 days, as long as rainfall continues. If you get a break in the rainfall, then you can take a break in your applications. But you want to start up the applications again shortly before forecasted rain. So why the emphasis on rain? Well, Ascochyta blight, once it's established in your crop, okay, whether that came from infected seed or it came from spores that were disseminated from overwintered chickpea residues. These are spores disseminated via air, okay, long distances. It doesn't really matter. Whatever way the chickpea Ascochyta blight got established in your field, once it's in that field, it only expands with rainfall events. In the chickpea Ascochyta lesions, you always see these little black dots. Those little black dots contain spore-producing structures. And the only way that those spores move to plant is when rainfall hits them and disperses by splashing the spores to the neighboring leaves and neighboring plants. Okay, so in the absence of rainfall, you get no disease spread. Okay, and so so everything is based on growth stage, disease, and rain. All right, if you're having that rainfall, you're at late vegetative growth, start scouting. If you find disease out there in 2 of 100 plants, spray. Okay, if you don't find disease, wait until bloom initiation. And if the rainfall is occurring, even if you don't find disease, spray. Okay, and if it's dry, you can wait. Okay, and now once you've started spraying, spray every 10 to 14 days as long as rainfall continues. If there's a break in rain, you can take a break in your applications, but start up again before the rainfall resumes. Okay, and that's application timing. So what should you apply? And so when disease pressure is low to moderate, all of the most effective products on the market provide satisfactory control. Okay, but I'm stressing the most satisfactory products. Within the triazole fungicides, these are the FRAC3 fungicides, Proline and Provisol are the most effective products. And these are the only products that we have found to be satisfactory. Okay, within the SDHI fungicides, Miravis Neo and Priaxor are the most effective products. Now, if you look at the labels, you'll see, oh, Miravis Neo is a premix and includes a triazole and a strobi fungicide. Well, yes, it is a premix, but the triazole in there has basically no efficacy against Ascochyta blight, and Ascochyta blight has developed resistance against the strobis. And for this reason, Miravis Neo, from all practical purposes, is a standalone SDHI when targeting Ascochyta blight of chickpeas. Same thing with Priaxor. Priaxor is a premix of a strobi headline, okay, Paraclostrobin, and an SDHI. But again, the Ascochyta blight pathogen has developed resistance to the strobi, so this is strobi fungicides, the QOY fungicides, and for that reason, Priaxor, for all practical purposes for Ascochyta management in chickpeas, is a standalone SDHI. These are the 2 most effective SDHIs that we have tested. Okay, now, if you want to use one of the new premixes that contain both SDHI and triazole active ingredients, Miravis Top and Revitec are the best products that we have tested. Okay, and any one of these products will provide very satisfactory disease control under low to moderate Ascochyta pressure. Now, one thing I want to add, a lot of people have been applying Delero rather than Proline. Delero is a premix of a strobi, of a QOY fungicide, and Proline. But the problem with Delero is that when you apply it at the labeled rate of 12 fluid ounces, it contains only 4.5 fluid ounces of Proline. Okay, and that's a cut rate of Proline, and accordingly, what we have seen in our trials and what I've heard from growers is that 12 fluid ounces of Delero behaves and performs like a cut rate of Proline. So if you're going to use 12 fluid ounces of Delero, you need to supplement that with 1.2 fluid ounces of Proline. Very good. That summarizes what fungicides to use under low to moderate disease pressure. What happens, though, when we get really cool, wet weather for an extended period during bloom and pod fill? You know, those are really high disease pressure scenarios for Ascochyta blight, especially when that drags on for 10, 20 days. And sometimes it does. Okay, under really bad, cool, wet summers. It doesn't look like this year is going to be one of those years, but we are inevitably going to have those years again. And so best learn what to do in those scenarios, because you can get very, very good management of Ascochyta in those scenarios if you manage your fungicides appropriately. So first off, let's talk a little bit about when these good fungicides work. Okay, and the answer is under low to moderate disease pressure. These are scatter plots that show the yield response that we've seen to these fungicides relative to disease pressure in different replicated fungicide efficacy studies that we have conducted across North Dakota over the last 12 years. And what you can see here is that as disease pressure goes up, the yield response to the fungicide goes up to a point. When disease pressure gets high enough, the fungicide gets overwhelmed and you no longer get additional yield response from the fungicide as disease pressure goes up. To the contrary, you start getting less of a yield response from the fungicide. What's happening is that the fungicide cannot keep up with the disease pressure. You do not get good disease control, and you really have disease control failure. We've seen it in our trials. You see it here in these data. And we've seen it with every single one of these fungicides that's on the market. okay? They all exhibit this. Under low to moderate disease pressure, they give you good control. And as that disease pressure goes up, initially they give you better and better control, more of a return on your investment. But when disease pressure gets to a certain point, the fungicide gets overwhelmed and no longer performs well. Okay, so this is one way to look at those data where you have these scatter plots. I'm going to show you another way to look at the same data. Here you have bar graphs, okay? These are bar graphs showing you the response to Proline versus a non-treated control under low disease pressure all the way to high disease pressure. Every one of these is a different replicated fungicide efficacy study. I pulled out the data for Proline and non-treated control for the purposes of illustrating my point here. But what you can see here is that under very low disease pressure, you're getting a consistent yield bump from the Proline, and that yield bump can be really quite high, and you're getting pretty good disease control. Once you get into that mid-40s range for Ascochyta pressure, suddenly your disease control no longer is very good. Okay, and you might say, well, it's a lot less than the control. Sure it is, but I'm sorry, but if you have 15 to 18% of the canopy disease between bloom and maturity, you're gonna have a lot of disease pods out there, a lot of shriveled seeds, a lot of necrotic seeds. This is not gonna be good quality, all right? And so what you can see is that the fungicide starts slipping at that point. But at that point, you're still at least getting a good yield bump. Okay, and as the disease pressure goes up even and even more, you'll see that you get to the point where you're no longer even getting that yield bump. The fungicide gets overwhelmed. You see the same thing with Priaxor. Here I've taken the data from all those trials in which we tested a non-treated control versus Priaxor at 4 fluid ounces versus Proline at 5.7 fluid ounces. And what you can see is that at the very low disease pressure on the very left side, that the Proline and the Priaxor perform equivalently. Okay, and this is Proline at 5.7 versus Priaxor at 4 versus Priaxor at 6 fluid ounces, okay? And they perform equivalently. As the disease pressure goes up, what you'll see here is that at a certain point, and this is when we get to that mid-60s in terms of disease pressure and the non-treated control, you'll see that that 4 fluid ounces of Priaxor is no longer performing equivalently to Proline. It's starting to get overwhelmed. The 6 fluid ounces of Priaxor is still holding on and performing equivalently to Proline. But then as you get to even higher disease pressure, you find that neither of those application rates of Priaxor are providing satisfactory disease control. Actually, the yields are basically zero. All right, I mean, the fungicide's completely overwhelmed. Do we have fungicide resistance? No, we have not found resistance to this SDHI fungicide. It's simply that there is so much disease pressure that the fungicide couldn't keep up and it was overwhelmed. So what do we do in those situations when the disease pressure gets really high? And this happens commercially. I get phone calls in these cool, wet years all the time. And the location that has the cool, wet year shifts, you know? Sometimes it's eastern Montana. Sometimes it's here in central North Dakota or western North Dakota. Sometimes it's out in South Dakota. It shifts by the year, but, you know, I get the same comments every year. Okay, whenever that a particular region growing chickpeas has these cool, wet weather. So it's not just in our trials. The growers see this, and this is real. So what do we do in that situation? The answer is that when the disease pressure gets really high or the conditions are really highly favorable for Ascochyta blight, you need to use Proline tank mix with Bravo Weather Stick, chlorothalonil. Okay, and what you can see is that this tank mix is like magic. You add these two products together and you get a synergistic response. And at all levels of disease pressure, we're seeing an increase in disease control and a big increase in yield. And so you see that same scatter plot here. Those yellow brown dots are the tank mix, and at every single level of disease pressure you're seeing better yield response to that tank mix than Proline alone. And those are trials where we only looked at the non-treated control, well, excuse me, trials where we looked at the non-treated control versus Proline plus that versus that tank mix. Okay, all three of those treatments were in those trials. Okay, and so this is an apples to apples comparison. You can see that we're consistently getting a better yield response by using that tank mix. And it doesn't matter the disease pressure. Okay, and And this is another way to look at those data, okay? Now I've combined analysis across those 5 studies in which we had low disease pressure. And what you can see is that that tank mix reduces your disease by about half versus the Proline alone and gives you over a 500-pound yield bump. And that's under relatively low Ascochyta pressure. And then you get to that somewhat higher disease pressure, and you can see that again, that tank mix is cutting your disease by over a half, and it's giving you that 500 or so pound yield advantage. And you know, that reduction in disease is huge because now you're getting decent quality chickpeas. There's no way you're getting good quality chickpeas when 21% of your canopy is diseased between bloom initiation and maturity, which is what that number represents, okay? That 9%, you're probably gonna get pretty good chickpeas. In most cases you are. Okay, and under that really high disease pressure, look at that. I mean, again, you're cutting your disease by more than half, and you're getting that same 500 plus pound yield advantage. And so this tank mix is like magic. Generic Proline should be on the markets this year, if not very soon thereafter. And so this is something that should be very affordable, either now or in the very near future, okay, whenever that generic Proline's on that market, okay? And what about tank mixing Bravo Weather Stick chlorothalonil with other fungicides? So we tested this with Priaxor relatively extensively. We have 5 trials. We're testing with other products as well, but right now we have a decent amount of data with Priaxor. And what do you see? Here's the Priaxor alone, and you see that curve where the fungicide gets overwhelmed at high levels of disease pressure. Okay, now look at the trials where we compared a non-treated control versus Priaxor alone versus Priaxor plus Bravo. And what you can see is that under that intermediate disease pressure, when the Ascochyta pressure in the non-treated control was anywhere from a 30 to about a 55, adding the Bravo did nothing. It's not like the Proline, okay? In this case, under that intermediate disease pressure, we got the exact same yield response adding the Bravo, okay? But where the Bravo helped you is when the disease pressure got really high. In those situations where the Priaxor failed, okay? Instead of the fungicide failing, now with the Bravo in the tank mix, you're still getting a really good yield response. You're still getting, your crop is saved. Okay, so this is not nearly as good as a tank mix as the Proline plus Bravo, because here you're not seeing that response at all levels of disease pressure, but you are still seeing it in the situation that really matters, i.e., when the Priaxor would otherwise fail. All right, so we've now discussed what your strategy should be when disease pressure is really high. And we all know this, cool, wet weather, especially extended period of cool, wet weather during bloom and pod fill. Okay, and so, and now the next critical question is, can I use a different brand of chlorothalonil? You know, we started this testing just on a lark. Frankly, we just decided to test something crazy, okay? And I happen to have Bravo Weather Stick sitting around. I had no idea it was the most expensive chlorothalonil on the market. Well, it turns out it is the most expensive chlorothalonil, and you can save yourself a lot of money going to other brands. So starting this last year, we started testing these other brands. And here you can see Bravo Weather Stick in a tank mix with Proline versus Praise in a tank mix with Proline versus EQ 720 in a tank mix with Proline. And what you can see on the disease control is we had absolutely equivalent disease control results for all 3 of those tank mixes. And but with the yield, you can see a numerical trend towards reduced yield, especially with the EQ 720, not so much with Praise, just a little bit in the Praise. Now, is that trend real? I doubt it. We get this type of noise in these small plot trials. We really need to do more testing to know for certain, but I doubt that that trend is real. We'll know for sure in future years, but by all means, at the very, very minimum, Praise is performing very, very similarly to Bravo Weather Stick and should be a good alternative. Praise is sold by Winfield. You have to go to a co-op to get that. The next question is, what application rates should you be using? Okay, Proline is registered at 5 to 5.7 fluid ounces an acre. Bravo Weather Stick and the generics, Praise, EQ720, are registered at 1.38 to 2.0 pints per acre. And the answer here is that we got the most, the only the combination that the only combination that consistently gave us increased yield is the higher rate of Proline. with the low rate of Bravo, okay? Sometimes increasing the Bravo rate helped us, so at least one of the 3 trials. But in all 3 of the trials, increasing the application rate of Proline from 5 to 5.7 fluid ounces increased our yield. And so the recommendation at this point, based on 3 studies, and this is research in progress. We'll have more data after this season. The recommendation at this point is to apply Proline at 5.7 fluid ounces and Bravo or generic at 1.38 pints an acre if you want to optimize disease control while minimizing your costs. That said, 5 fluid ounces of Proline plus Bravo is better than 5.7 fluid ounces of Proline alone. But if you have the money to increase your Proline rate to 5 to 5.7 fluid ounces an acre, it pays under high disease pressure, and it's well worth the money. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is how should you apply these fungicides, okay? And we've been testing fungicide spray droplet size and how you optimize that. And we're testing this with Proline alone versus this tank mix. And we do this with a tractor-mounted R&D sprayer. It's a PTO-driven system, and we made applications at 9 miles an hour in 2019 and 10.5 miles an hour in 2020. So these are real-world driving speeds done with real-world equipment. We have a pulse width modulation system from Capstan Ag equipped on the sprayer, and this allows us to keep our spray volume the same and our driving speed the same, even as we use tips that change in output. Okay, and all we do is modify our pulse width to keep the spray volume the same and keep our driving speed the same. All of these outputs are measured manually. You can see that we use these milk jugs, if you will, to measure the output. And we have an older system, the Captan pulse modulation system that allows us to manually set the pulse width. And so we manually set the pulse width based on the measured output, and then we manually set our driving speed so that we have everything absolutely precise and consistent. All right, these are huge studies. Again, we've been running like 6 acres of chickpea Ascochyta trials in Carrington alone in the last couple of years. Here's an aerial view of the application studies. This last year, you can see our tractor driving passes. And yeah, this was right as the chickpeas were starting to senesce. All right, so what did we learn thus far? And this is research in progress. And what you can see here is that in 2019, our canopy was very open when the disease started to develop. We had significant disease development actually at late vegetative growth. And we started our first applications about a week before bloom. And in 2020, we didn't have any significant disease development until early mid-pod, when about 80 to 90% of the plants had pods. And many of the plants had 2 or more pods. And so in 2019, we applied to a very open canopy when disease started developing at a significant level. In 2020, our canopy was at or near closure. Okay, and so this is Proline applied alone. And what you can see with the T-jet nozzles is that when we applied to a very open canopy when disease started developing, you can see that we optimized with fine droplets. This makes sense. I mean, you optimize your coverage and you have no problem getting your droplet inside that canopy when the canopy is open. Okay, in 2020 though, you can see that we optimized with T-jet droplets with medium droplets. Okay, and there's very little difference between the various classifications of medium there. And so we needed a coarser droplet to get inside that canopy when the disease really started significantly developing at early to mid pod fill. Okay, and with Wilger nozzles, we see the same trend. We needed fine droplets to optimize fungicide performance when the canopy was wide open, and yet coarser droplets when the canopy was at or near closure. And this coming year, we're going to be modifying this to actually change our droplet size with canopy closure. Okay, but what you can conclude from this is that you need to calibrate your droplet size relative to canopy characteristics if you're using one of these locally systemic fungicides, something like a Priax or a Revitec, Miravis Top, Miravis Neo, Proline, okay, or Provisol. Okay, any of these products to use a fine droplet if your canopy is open, a medium droplet if your canopy is starting to close, and a medium to coarse droplet if your canopy is really, really dense. Okay. And one thing to remember is that the Wilshire nozzles, the droplet size spectrum is a little bit different from all appearances. We're working to quantify this rigorously, but what we have seen is that there's always a bit of a shift. And so what Wilshire considers coarse, TJET seems to consider medium. Okay. Very good. And so what about that tank mix? How do you optimize that? One of the things about chlorothalonil is that it's a contact fungicide with absolutely no systemic movement. And so contact fungicides cannot compensate for poor coverage by moving systemically in the plant. Wherever the fungicide is deposited is where it's at. Okay, you apply Proline with a medium to coarse droplet to a canopy that is at or near closure. That medium coarse droplet has the velocity to get inside that canopy. You don't have near the coverage, but again, the product has some local systemic movement, and so it's able to compensate a little bit for that lack of coverage. Now, if you're applying with a contact fungicide that has no systemic movement, you can't compensate. And so coverage alone becomes the major driving factor. And so let's look at this. It didn't matter on TJET nozzles, we optimized with fine droplets when we used this tank mix, irrespective of the level of canopy closure, okay, when the disease came in. And with Wilshire nozzles, you can see that there's basically no response to droplet size, okay? And when the canopy was at or near closure. But when the canopy was wide open, you definitely optimize with fine droplets. This is research that's still in progress. But again, the take home is this. If you're using a locally systemic fungicide applied alone, something like Provisol, Proline, Priaxor, Miravis Neo, Miravis Top, or Revitec, if you're using those products, apply your fungicide with a droplet size calibrated relative to canopy characteristics. Okay, and so if the canopy is wide open, use a fine droplet. If the canopy is nearing closure, use a medium droplet. And only go to a coarse droplet if your canopy is extremely dense. Okay? If you're using this tank mix with Bravo Weather Stick, I'd recommend you using fine droplets, irrespective of canopy closure, unless you're using a Wilshire tip, in which case, if the canopy starts getting quite dense, you might consider using a medium droplet size. Okay, those are recommendations on droplet size. Conclusions here, and you can pause this video and read these. But in summary, we have reviewed when to make your fungicide application. We have reviewed what fungicides to apply when disease pressure is expected to be low to medium. We have reviewed what fungicides to apply when you expect disease pressure to be very high. Okay, and we've reviewed what droplet size to be utilizing. All that information is on that slide. I'm not going to repeat it at this point because you can read that on your own. Just pause the video and read it. It's all available for you there. And I am available if you have any questions. Okay, my email address is michael.wunsch@ndsu.edu. And the phone number is 701-652-2951. That information is here on the slide. You can pause that, write that down, and contact me at any time. With that, I am appreciative that you took the time to listen to this. I hope this information was valuable to you. We are continuing the droplet size work. We are continuing the work on the generic forms of Bravo Weather Stick. We are continuing the rate response work on optimizing the application rates of Proline and Bravo Weather Stick or generics in tank mix combinations. But I have provided you preliminary information because at this point we have enough data to get a pretty good idea of what's going on. And the droplet size results, for instance, are very consistent with what we're seeing in terms of response to fungicide droplet size on other crops and other diseases. So these results are not surprising, and again, we'll have more rigorous recommendations with more data, but these data should be enough to be able to proceed with confidence at this point that that you can improve your current practices by adopting some of these, or at least experimenting with some of these practices in your operation. Thank you. I welcome your comments. Let us all hope and pray that we get the rainfall that we need this season to have successful crops. Hope you have a wonderful season. It's been a pleasure to share this information with you, and I'm available if you have any questions.